working will change our cities and our homes. I think maybe last year might have been slightly more of a theoretical question. And this year, as a result of lockdown, we've all been experimenting on how it's going to work. I'm going to introduce 3 speakers today, all who've got different business interests, and they're going to talk about what has changed, how it's working and what's not working. First up is Ryan Prince, who is the man from Uncle, which is a no-nonsense renting company operating in London and Manchester. We have Anna Strongman, a managing partner at Argent, with a number of iconic developments, including the one at King's Cross. And finally, Gabriela Hersham, who is CEO at Huckletree, which is a workspace for innovative companies. We are going to come on to coronavirus and the effects of that and what it's taught us about them. And we're going to come on to each of these speakers and ask them to explain what they do. But first of all, I'd like to talk about how we got to where we are now. Now, the city, as we know, it really began to develop in about the 18th and 19th century with office culture. But it's really in the 20th century that the office becomes the norm. Why do we think that worked so well for the 20th century? Ryan, could I start with you?
Sure. As you say, the evolution of the office really came out of sort of clerk work, and you look at those photographs about organizing people. And I think over time, the concept of sort of the manufacturing process of people moving into then where we've got to today, which is culture. So I think the purpose of the office has morphed a lot, I think, as time has gone on. It started out as a way to organize people, and then it's turned into a way in the knowledge economy of how to catalyze creativity and knowledge in an environment that people adhere to and work well in and excel in. So I think it's been on an evolution, and part of, I suspect, what we'll talk about today is where are we on that curve and what does that bode for the future?
And it's also been matched in the domestic sphere in that since the 19th century in particular, you have particular residential districts, don't you, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the evolution of an agrarian to an industrialized and then urban economy has changed what our needs are for housing. And our area of expertise at Real Star and at Uncle is in the housing space. And so what the needs are, what sizes are, proximity, where do you want to be close to and for what reason, is on a constant evolution. And along with that, all of the city infrastructure and wider questions around transportation, amenity, education, employment, sort of all filter into that. And in a way, I think more and more housing is becoming a form of social infrastructure more than just a traditional kind of real estate asset class.
Okay. Anna, Argent, it's a huge property company, highly successful. What was working for, what was it about the 20th century that meant we decided to do office culture in such a way? And what was it that was good about it?
I think the increasing specialization of work combined with great innovation in transport allowed work to be split from home. And that really started during the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, that was really cemented through the growth of the office culture and cities. And I think what is quite interesting from our perspective is really the beginning of the urban renaissance from the 1990s onwards, and the role of the office and the return of people to living in cities from that point on. I mean, post-war, living in London wasn't a particularly popular choice, and you see a real dip in the population then. That began to increase again from the 80s onwards. And we have really seen, first at Brindley Place in Birmingham and more recently at King's Cross, that the renaissance of the office, I'd say, how the office has really become a focus for the head of people in companies and the CEOs and the CFOs, really focusing on getting the best office, using the office to create a creative and productive culture, using the office to really attract the best employees, and really making sure that the office is within a wider environment which supports all of those trends. And I think, well, we're going to come on to talk about COVID, but I think it's very interesting about how that will then play out against this background of remote working, because certainly the big global companies we've worked with at King's Cross, the office is essential to their HR strategies and to their creative and cultural drives.
Gabriela, your company has clearly spotted that something that was happening in the 20th century is not necessary for the 21st century. And that, I presume in your view, is the idea that you have a serried ranks of desks and large companies. Yours is developing a sort of agility. What were those companies doing beforehand? What was happening? You know, if you had a small growth company, a startup, what were they doing 20, 30 years ago?
Well, first of all, we've seen, you know, there are many, many more of those companies today than there were 20, 30 years ago. So I think, you know, even when the co-working industry kind of exploded, and I guess that happened sort of around, you know, 2007, 2008, even at that time, there weren't the amount of sort of startups, scale-ups, technology businesses as there are today. And I think, you know, it is important, the guys have referenced this really well, but it's important to remember what the purpose of the office was 50 years ago. You know, 50 years ago, the office was there to solve the problem. And the problem was that they needed to host loads of people in one room. They needed to almost monitor their activity. These people needed to have access to documentation that was physical documentation at the time, and communication, obviously. And those matters, they don't exist today as problems for the office to solve. They're not as relevant anymore. They've kind of fallen like a chain of dominoes, whereas what we need today is to create spaces, very much to Anna's point, where employees feel inspired and motivated and ultimately produce their best work and help to contribute to a really strong culture for their organization. So the office has really evolved over the past 50 years, and I think it will continue doing so. And we may not recognize today the office of 50 years' time as 50 years ago. They'd look at our office today and think, these guys are crazy. What are they doing?
Okay, listen, tell me a little bit about Huckletree and what it does in terms of the workspace culture, what it's picking up in terms of demand from its users, and what direction you think things are going to go in from now.
So as a business, what we do is we are a workspace accelerator. We have 7 communities around London, Manchester, Dublin, and Oslo, and they're all themed. We cater very much to the tech ecosystem, but some of our buildings are themed. For example, we have venture hubs, we have digital lifestyle hubs, we've got a challenger tech hub, etc. And within that, we build community. So it's more than just the office and what the physical elements of the office is, but it's about putting events on. It's about inspiring the businesses that are members of ours to ultimately grow their own culture and to help them in doing so. So that's kind of us as a business and what we do. And in terms of the trends that we're seeing, obviously, I think the past sort of 11, 12 weeks have been a huge global work from home experiment that has shown us that working from home actually is productive, and arguably for that solitary work, more productive even than going into the workspace. But as I was saying, the workspace is a fluid product. And I think what is going to happen over the next sort of few years is that it is going to evolve into becoming an experiential hub. So you can do your solitary work at home, but what you can't do is do the more kind of collaborative, creative work flows that the office space will be there to provide for. And that's certainly what we're seeing in terms of demand and in terms of the trends in our industry.
Anna, since I started my working life, the offices I've been into have changed somewhat. There's still the person on the door, the reception person. But actually what is being offered in those spaces is radically different. When big companies are coming to you, what are they asking you for in terms of the setup, not just in the office, but in the environment around it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think those global companies are really focused on attracting top global talent. So they are completely focused on providing the right environment for their employees. And I'd say, you know, in the past, we used to talk to the CFOs and the CEOs. Now the head of people, the HR directors are always part of the conversation. And I think that reflects the shift to some degree. And I think at King's Cross, what has attracted those big companies? I mean, there are some practical things. So we have built big buildings with big floor plates, with a lot of space, and that's what those companies are looking for. But they're also very attracted to being part of a campus within a city. And I use the word campus, with a little bit of awkwardness, because, we deliberately set out at King's Cross to create a place which felt like a real part of the city. But there's no doubt that the public realm and the quality of the public realm and the outdoors environment creates a sense of space within the city. It contributes to a sense of well-being. The ground floor, the restaurants, and spilling out into the public realm creates a sense of vibrancy and a sociability to the space. And I think that quality of amenity is absolutely critical to attracting those tenants. I think we also provide a lot of events, free events, cultural events. We put on a lot of fitness activities. Again, health and well-being is massive issue for those companies and their employees. And we also create spaces with people in it. People love people. People love just watching other people. And I think that sense of civicness is hard to define, but is also critical to creating an environment that people want to be part of.
We're going to come back to the question of how coronavirus lockdown, social distancing is going to affect that. Ryan, the spaces you're far more in the domestic realm than these two, but now working from home has become a thing. What are people asking for in terms of how their houses are organised? In the old days, you were lucky if you got an extra half bedroom in which you can put a desktop computer. What do we want now?
Well, in many ways, Uncle was set up a few years ago now to address, I think we'll have 9 locations around London by the end of next year. And the idea behind Uncle was kind of anchored on the fact that renting and living and renting sort of felt like British Airways felt like before Virgin came into the space. It was everybody did it. The general consensus around that space was bad service, treated badly. It was kind of the old BT kind of narrative. And so when, I came from a hotel background, and in the hotel world, what we would call tenants in the real estate business are your customers. And so your goal is to keep them happy and keep them coming back. In the case of hotels, in the case of where you live, the idea is you want people to stay there because they're happy and they're thrilled with the way you treat them. So we sort of invented Uncle as a brand that does 2 things. One is speaks directly to the general demographic of our customer, which is kind of 30 years old, and ranges from 20 to 50 or 60, but that's probably about the sweet spot. And the idea is, on the one hand, I just had this idea that it's kind of renting for cynics. Everybody, rightly so, people are going to come at it through the lens of, I don't believe you can be treated halfway decently in a place you rent. And at the same time, the goal for the people who live on our properties, we tell them, is to make our customers cry with tears, ideally tears of joy or laughter. But the idea is to treat them in a way that surprises them in the way that human behavior is. Because fundamentally, your home, similar to traveling on an airplane or renting a car, there are some core functions. You cook there, you sleep there, you clean there, and as you say, now you work there. And so the idea is, how can we create a space that allows for both privacy? So we're not a co-living community. The idea is you have your own space. It is your own apartment. You do whatever you want there. And at the same time, there's shared spaces. And we think probably more in terms of vertical neighborhoods than in terms of communities. So my general view is, people make communities. I don't really think I can or we can make a community. I think we can create an environment or a platform or a space that facilitates that. So I'm a big believer, if you read Richard Thaler's Nudge book, the idea we can do nice little things that help cultivate an experience that people meet their neighbors. And that's really what we want to do, is sort of have that feeling of a throwback where in a perfect world, you could leave your door unlocked and feel like anyone could come and go and feel safe and secure and happy in that. And that's what Uncle's about. And I think some of our spaces will pivot, but we always had co-working spaces built into our amenity spaces. We've always had gym and wellness. I think the universe of customer who's interested in that today will have shifted from some of our student demographic and gig economy workers now to the wider scope of anyone who works in a business. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit later about, you know, what's going to be different in the scheme of things. I think one big topic will be is work from home space will now be a prerequisite for anyone who's thinking about building anything residential for the foreseeable future. So I think that will be a structural change. You know, you might rather have that than a dining room you would today. And the origins of work from home space was, you know, a basement closet that you didn't know what to do with. I think that's going to be a significant change in the functionality of what apartments or houses are there to do.
Well, I'm a central London renter, and trust me, the kitchen has become virtually redundant. It's a really good storage space. I occasionally put books in there. Yeah. Let's just go on to coronavirus. So what has happened in the last, 10 weeks or so is that we have all been thrust into this, well, keyboard workers have been thrust into this great experiment of how you can detach yourself from going into work, your old routines, sitting at a desk, and then getting up and leaving. Some change is very exciting. Some change, we can talk about this in kind of glowing fashion, but there are certain losses. So what do you think has actually worked in this new world, and what do you think doesn't work in this new world? And Anna, as the person who's got the big offices, what do you think doesn't function as a result of it?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. And I think what has amazed us is that we've actually managed to all work from home. But we are definitely seeing some areas where it doesn't work so well, particularly from our perspective as a developer, owner, operator. So I'd say it's challenging around creative processes, particularly around design, building design, master plan design, complex problems amongst multiple stakeholders. It's hard to solve on a Zoom call. I would say the very difficult HR issues are also difficult remotely, and also not always that humane to do remotely. I would say in particular challenge for us has been around junior members of our team. And we've realized how much those people pick up through a natural osmosis. And actually, when they're not in the office, they don't pick up conversations going on. There's no small amount of course correction at the photocopier where you say, oh, I won't do that, I'll do it that, do that, or have you talked to so-and-so? And also those are the people in our company who tend to be in smaller accommodation, who don't have the luxury of studies or reception rooms. So I think that has been a particular challenge for us to provide that mentoring and knowledge sharing at an informal level with the more junior members of the team. I also think deal negotiation is all about body language, and it's hard to do body language on Zoom. So there are a number of areas really where we sense that there are challenges not being in the office, and also, to be frank, I just think people are missing the sociability of it. And an office is a place of productivity, it's a place of creativity, but it's also a place of sociability, and it's a very important social place for lots of people, and it provides social networks, it provides individual confidence, friendships, all sorts of things. And I think in the long term that if this was to go on much longer, those things would suffer as well.
Okay. Ryan, what's been good for you as a result of lockdown, and particularly in terms of people who are renting for you and how they're living? By the way, if for the audience here, I'm not quite sure if you are able to add comments to this, but if you can, save your questions for later. But if you've got any comments on what coronavirus has changed about the way you work, the way your family works, and what's worked and what's not, do feel free to just add little comments along the side, and I'll try and incorporate them. So Ryan, what's worked in terms of your renters, and where do you think, well, actually, lockdown hasn't been such a great idea, or not?
Well,
sorry.
Look, I mean, I think, I guess a couple observations. My main observation would be outside the gig economy, there, I think, was historically a stigma about working from home. What are you actually doing and so on. And I think there will be lots of things that we don't know what the long-term implications are, but I genuinely believe one of the long-term implications will be the stigma about working from home will largely be gone. That doesn't mean people are going to work from home only, but I do think that negative connotation has largely disappeared from most employers' minds about the ability to do it. I think then it transitions into what will be the long-term implication of that. And I suspect you're going to see a mix. So the only study I've really seen, Gensler in the US put out a study where they surveyed 2,300 different employees of companies. I think it was all companies of 100 plus employees. So say medium to large size companies, different seniorities. And basically the conclusion was only 12% of all the people that they surveyed wanted to work from home on a full-time basis after all this subsides, even if you had a vaccine. So, and the lion's share of the reason why was people. It was sort of going to the point about, when Anna was making, is that people want people around for a whole variety of reasons, particularly younger people. So if you looked at that survey, probably 40% of people who are 50 plus would have said, I'm happy to work at home 3 to 4 days a week, 1 to 3 days a week, but almost nobody wants to work at home 5 days a week. And most of it has to do with all the different comments that were made earlier. So I think that's anecdotally what people are thinking in businesses. And I think we're now using up that social kind of goodwill bank that we've had, most of us, from teams that have been around for a long time. But when you think about new people and how do you recruit them and bring them in and create the culture that you have in your businesses, whatever that business is, it's going to be tough. The advantage, I think, of all this, though, is work from home is going to be a much more permanent feature, and that therefore the buildings and how they operate will be more permanent. So my own belief is you're going to have work colleagues, and then I think in the future you're going to have something like home working colleagues. So I could see in our buildings having co-working spaces of people who work in totally different businesses knowing each other because they all work from home on Monday and Thursday, and eating together, if we're ever allowed to do that again, and doing things in a way, and actually in some nice way, may even create a more neighborhood, a totally different social network than today we live in, especially if you live in an apartment building. You really don't know who all your neighbors are. Actually, you may create a whole other range of people and a network that you don't have today. And I think that may be a long-term outcome from our side of things on the kind of home residential side.
Okay, Ryan has just cited stats from one poll, and we're going to do a poll ourselves for our viewers today, which is, which do you prefer? Do you prefer working from home, or do you prefer going into the office? And here we are, and we've got some results. Here we are, home, 51%, office 32%, and no preference 17%. So those are the ones I presume don't mind running into the office for a few days and then staying at home again. I no longer have a small child at home, but I have read various accounts and have various friends who are struggling without the division between work life and home life. And I just wonder whether, in fact, it is quite important for us to accept that working from home, while it seems like a very nice thing to do, particularly if you are living alone, is actually incredibly challenging. Gabriela, the sort of people who come to you, I know they're doing startups and tech and innovation, but I think the office is also thought of as an escape from that, the atomization of a sort of home life, which you can't really leave. And there's always somebody nagging you to do something.
I mean, I know exactly what you are referring to, because just before this, my husband and I were in a bit of a clash about, I'm using the desk, no, I'm using the desk. So I think, one thing that we haven't addressed is that remote working isn't always conducive to good and positive mental health. And I think amongst our communities, we're definitely hearing a lot of stories about that, and trying to support everybody's roots back into the office. I think a lack of...
open at the moment.
So our spaces have been open throughout. Yes, obviously, Boris has never, told offices to close mandatorily. I think the kind of suggestion has been that people who can't work from home can still go to the office. So yes, our spaces have been opened throughout, and we're now actually putting the teams back in place as more and more people are trickling back into the offices. And I think, for a lot of them, and definitely for me, for myself, when you are working from home, I do have young children at home. I've got 2 of them. And for me, there is definitely a lack of clearly defined boundaries between, my work and my play, and actually, my private life being quite public. And I know we've all faced that over these past months, people, seeing into our homes and how we're living, and just the feeling of having to constantly be on. And I think that can also lead to, the days feeling like they're rolling into one. So I think for a lot of us, not having this boundary makes it quite tricky, and can make it all seem a bit overwhelming. So there's definitely that element of it where it is nice to have the balance to be able to go into the office, but also, work from home on days where your work stream could accommodate for that.
Okay, there's something quite fundamental about changing how we work, which is there is a whole infrastructure developed around a city, around the idea that we get up in the mornings, we get on the tube to go to work, we turn up at an office, there's a coffee bar nearby. But the minute we stop using transport, the money begins to go out of that. Anna, I know the King's Cross one well, has some beautiful high-end sort of flagship commercial stores. But if people are going to spend more time at home rather than the office, surely the flagship store is in zone 2 rather than in zone 1. Anna, I'm going to come to you first. How do you think this sort of drive to go and work from home is going to start changing how kind of property developments and local areas work, city areas, not domestic areas?
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of various discussions about the growth of satellite areas. I don't think satellite towns is a good word to use, but towns which are outside of London, and areas in zones 4 to 5 in London, which might see the growth of offices and the support that. And the footfall they bring to support retail, revival of town centres. And that may well happen. My sense is that central London, that there was a consolidation of retail and F&B anyway. We all know the trends in that sector. And I think this has accelerated those trends. But I think those key attractive primary locations in central London will revive, and that will be partly about office workers returning, and it will also be about people who come to the city for leisure and people who live in the city. I think what's noticeable about I live in Camden, what is noticeable is since the easing of the lockdown, the large numbers of young people who are out doing their best to social distance, but out having fun in the parks, in the squares, and I think that amongst that generation in particular, they will want to get back to the city and they will want to get back to bars and restaurants as fast as they can, and I suspect a lot of them will want to get back to the offices as well. So there's no doubt that we're going to see a change and an influence on property development, and I think we will see the growth of some other locations, but I think those prime locations in central London, which were where activity was consolidating around anyway, that consolidation will continue.
Okay, one of the great promises of the Boris Johnson 29 Conservative election campaign was full fibre broadband everywhere, which I totted up at costing about 30 billion, which is a drop in the ocean compared to furlough pay. However, most of us do not have very good internet connections elsewhere. How do you think we can legitimately kind of get to a home working position when we don't have that sort of infrastructure in the domestic sphere? Ryan, would you like to pick that one up?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you did a survey of our residents and said, would you like your electricity turned off for 24 hours or your internet turned off for 24 hours? You know what your answer would be. So internet has become the lifeblood of everybody who functions today more than hot water. And I think that that's absolutely critical. So how long it will take to roll that internet into outside, it's already, there's good bits and bad bits in London, but once you get outside of London, we all know the statistics, how the UK stacks. And I think that's critical infrastructure. I also think that there's been a lot written about, are we going to see the the pendulum swing back from cities back out to the suburbs? And what will that look like? Because if you don't have to be in the office and you can work from home, I'm much more skeptical of that. I think even anecdotally in London, anyone who's lived here a reasonable amount of time, I mean, I've lived here almost 25 years, the weather for the last 3 months has been something like no one's ever seen before. And so the attractiveness of being outside in your garden has held a different level of appeal than probably it has done in any moment in time I can think going back. I just don't see that as a massive trend. I see that as a minor trend, and maybe that will happen at the margins. But I'm with Anna. I think ultimately, especially young people, especially given that London is a knowledge economy, fundamentally people will want to be around one another. I can see some cascading, like I can see young people going to bars and restaurants, slightly older people only going to different kinds of restaurants, and my parents staying at home. So I can see, depending on how different people behaving differently based on their risk profiles. And I suspect in a second wave, that would be my bet as to how things transpire.
I think I might disagree. I think there's a certain section of the sort of perhaps over 50s who've been absolutely frustrated by being told to go home and will be first out owning the town.
Well, there's always the fun. There's the fun bunch. I'm just talking about the middle. Yeah,
I think also that because of the way the property market was going in London, that there's a lot of development going on outside of central London. So we are building basically a new town in North London around Brent Cross and the North Circular. And that has got a significant amount of offices in it alongside the residential, which will create a mixed use environment, which really creates a kind of a very meaningful place. But I think this will have actually made those offices more attractive and will help drive that real kind of mixed use environment opposed to just a residential one. So I think that there is activity going on outside of the core central London development areas anyway, and I think this will actually support development in those areas. Canada Water is another example.
I do think the $64,000 question that no one's got an answer to today is, depending on where we are on access and safety, how you're going to deal with high-rise office and just getting up and down and in and out of a building. That to me is still a bit of a mystery. I just have absolutely no idea how that plays itself out.
Okay, Anna, can I just ask, in Brent Cross, have you managed to put in some full fibre broadband?
Well, there's a lot of focus on the digital infrastructure, partly because actually of the lessons we learned from King's Cross, where actually the offices are very well connected, but the public realm is less well connected, and we learned some big lessons from that, because really you need. It's exactly what Ryan said. The expectations of people to be connected at all times, whether they're inside or whether they're outside, and have absolute seamless connectivity. It's just there, and we haven't been as seamless as we've wanted to be at King's Cross. So it's now a top priority at Brent Cross.
Gabriela, Huckletree. Sorry, I don't know the locations off the top of my head. Are they all central London, or have you got any in the outer zones?
So I think the we've got one in zone 2 and the rest in London are in zone 1. The one in zone 2 is White City. So for me, that feels still pretty central.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's our most kind of remote one, if you will.
Are you beginning to feel any sort of hunger from the peripheral, kind of essentially the villages of London, to actually take up workspace? I know I visited one in Queen's Park, which was probably not the same profile as the companies that come to work for you. A lot of it was solo workers who just needed to get out of their houses, and some of them were academics, some of them were running small businesses, but they seemed to value very much the fact they could just walk 500 yards from their house and disconnect. Have you got a kind of vibe about that going on at all?
Yeah, we do. And I definitely agree with Anna's point that, hubs that are located in more residential areas will fare really well over the coming years. I definitely think that people want to have access to a workspace, as you say, Joy, that just isn't that far away from home. And we're definitely seeing that. So we've got, so I think we've got a couple of spaces in central London, but then our Shoreditch and our White City spaces on the opposite extremes of the city are really good examples where we may have a business that is based out of one, but actually half of their workforce, might work on the other side of town. And now, interestingly, what they're looking at doing is almost splitting their membership between our two locations, between Shoreditch and White City, so that depending on where their employees live, they can choose which of the two offices they go to, rather than saying everybody who works at this company has to be located at Huckletree West in White City. So it is very interesting, and I think there's definitely much more of an understanding now that people are a little bit more afraid to get on public transport. And just want to have access to an office that is, within walking or easy cycling distance from their homes. So definitely that is a trend that we are seeing a lot of.
Okay, as is inevitable, but also completely understandable, each of you is defending your own position and why your version of the world is the best. However, there are kind of a couple of problems that are coming up. So, for example, delivery culture means that the small shops in the high street will be suffering because Amazon is suddenly knocking on your door because they're promising to deliver absolutely everything. Transport begins to be defunded. Areas that I live in Soho. It is, I've actually come up from the countryside because it's too noisy in the countryside. It's so quiet here. Areas like this have just, all the life has just disappeared out of them. There are going to be winners and losers in this particular change of circumstances. Do you actually think that, can you see the flip side of the positions you're both pulling for? And do you think we should begin to look at whether we want to return the city to what it was? I'm going to start with you, Gabriela, because you're offering an incredibly good offer to anybody who wants to disengage from the full-time office at the moment. Can you see the downside?
The downside to working full-time in a workspace, I actually don't think that is going to be the case. I think that there is a massive trend towards flexibility, and actually what flexibility means is not just about where your desk is located, but it's really a mindset that these companies, big or small, are going to have to adopt. And so I definitely see that it is going to be more balanced towards putting that flexibility and that optionality in the hands of the employees over the coming years, and I think that is a great thing. And ultimately, I think that look, I was also in Soho yesterday. I was at our space in Soho yesterday, and you're completely right. It is a ghost town. But to Anna's point, that will return and that will revive. And I don't think any one of us is saying that everybody is going to be working either at home or in the office permanently, over the years to come. I think we seem to be in consensus that there will be more flexibility and that there will be more of a balance. And I think the world is definitely ready for it.
Anna, Argent at some level requires a certain amount of footfall for its sites to really operate. Footfall is a little bit of a problem at the moment as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a concern for us, obviously, because we need footfall to support our restaurants and to support our to support the shops and support the bars, and that they need footfall. It's their lifeblood, and we're very concerned, and we're doing everything we can to pull people back into the city. And we're very fortunate at King's Cross, for example, because we have large areas of public realm. And the public realm, in a way, it acts as an attraction in its own right. So there are a lot of people already who are coming back to King's Cross to just enjoy the outdoor spaces there. And I think one interesting thing about the whole lockdown has shown the absolute critical role that outdoor space plays as an amenity. And you could see that in the public debate about closing parks in central London. And I think there will be more and more demand for access to public space as a public good, effectively, in cities. And I think in terms of, so I've got two other points. The first is around flexibility of home working. I agree with Gabriela. There will be more flexibility. And I think that's very interesting. I think Ryan pointed to that, about that concept of trust between employers and employees. And actually working from home, you do have to trust your employees. And I think that has challenged businesses and their attitude to people who work for them in a good and positive way. So I hope that will be something which will continue. In terms of cities, I fundamentally believe that cities are places of exchange of knowledge, they're places of exchange of culture, they're exchange of ideas, they're economic exchange, social exchange. They are the heart they are drivers really for our wider social and economic outputs and benefits. And whether it happens or not, I really hope that they can become vibrant and full of exchange again, because I think that there is something about that intensity of exchange that cities can offer, which are fundamental to driving our communities forward. So it might be a wish, it might not be a reality, but it's something that I really believe in, and I hope will come back in the future.
Well, I'm very much hoping King's Cross opens up again, because my hairdresser is on your estate and I'm really missing him at the moment. Ryan, to speak to Anna's point about the idea that a city is kind of, there is a sort of apex there of kind of intellectual, social and creative ability. By encouraging working from home and creating domestic spaces in which you can do that, I'm sorry to ask the challenging questions right at the end, but do you feel you might be sucking something away from the very city that people want to live in?
Well, I guess I go back to the core thing about this. What's going on right now hasn't really changed our business one way or the other. Fundamentally, we offer a home for people to do all the things they've always done in their home, which is sleep there, eat there, host their friends there, and so on. The work from home piece, I think, is an additional thing that is a tweak, but really not material to our overall kind of story in life. We generally tend to be we're the opposite of Huckletree, so we would be zone 2 to 5. So we are more affordable, commutable locations for people who work in various parts of the city. And I guess my overarching theme of all this is sort of this idea of a hybrid or fluidity. I think if you look at the customer of certainly millennial, Gen Z type people, there's a fluidity to what they do, which is they do things for a while, but they're not particularly stuck on doing the same thing for 5 years in a row. And so they may use our gym when they move in the building and use it for the first 6 or 8 months, and then they'll join the gym box that opened down the road, and they may use our coffee shop downstairs, but then they'll go to something else over time. So I think these things are a bit like an accordion or a bit like a traffic jam. They sort of ebb and flow, where they use things and they fall in love with the Peloton studio, and then they don't bother with Peloton for a year. I just think that's the way that that universe of people operate. And so it'll be great for a while, and then it won't, and then they'll come back and get into meditation, and then they won't. And I just think that's the way, in our world, that's how people are operating. And so I think all of these things around flexibility, choice, and fluidity is what the future is going to be. And having choice along that journey is what's going to be important.
Okay. It's been a brilliant discussion. I'm going to ask you each a question to which I want literally a 2-word answer. Do you want the city to be a more chilled out, quiet place like it is now, or do you want it to be hectic and busy again? Ryan?
Hectic, busy.
Gabriela?
I want the best of both worlds.
Personal.
Yeah, hectic, busy, buzzing, where we all want to be.
Didn't we all love the peace and quiet a couple of weeks ago? What's changed? We're all just getting bored.
Listen, that was just like a holiday. You don't want that forever.
Listen, that's
not
the end
with 2-year-old twins. So that is.
Okay. Listen, we're going to rejoin our audience in 15 minutes on, I believe, this stage, but I think Andrew will tell us where that's going to be. Thank you all for your points of view. Thank you all for being so kind of open about your businesses and for having such a wide and interesting point of views. Andrew.
Thanks, joining guests, for a fantastic panel. As Joy said, if you'd like to continue the conversation, please keep posting questions in Slido, and then you can join an after the panel Q&A. That will not be on YouTube. To join that, you'll have to go into the CogX platform and find the Q&A session that follows this panel if you have the right type of tickets. You're watching the Planet, Cities and Space stage at CogX 2020, where our theme this year is how do we make the best of the next 10 years? Our next session on this stage will begin at 2 p.m, where we'll be looking at the role of the consumer in the drive towards net zero. I hope to see you all then.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.